Hello. Hey, welcome to History Chats this afternoon. Yeah, I think that's working. Good. Yeah, we're going to get started in just about a minute or two here. If you're watching this after the fact, feel free to just skip ahead as I make sure that all of the audio is working and that things are working correctly. Yes. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I think it should be fine. So I think we'll just give people a little bit of time here just to join if they'd like to um, hear about some history here. We're continuing our month-long theme of some of the neighborhoods of Wausau today, and yeah, it should be an interesting one. Just a second here. Cool. So while we're waiting, just to let you know, if you're watching this the day it comes out or not too long afterwards, this weekend we actually have the last History Speaks of our season. History Chats, which we're doing right now, is our weekly, about half an hour or less thing, but we bring in experts, guest people who are knowledgeable about different stories about Wisconsin and our part of the world here. And the next one, which is this Saturday, November 12th at 2 p.m. This is a live event here at the Historical Society, but Mike O'Connor is going to be coming and talking about the story of Dick Bong, who was during World War II the top ace in the United States, the ace of aces, Wisconsin native, and someone who has a very interesting story. So Mike has done some research and had actually written a book years ago about the story, and it's it'd be good program. So I hope you come out to that if you're looking for something to do. We probably will be recording it and making it available later. But if you want to be there in person and be part of the experience, we're going to be doing it live 2 p.m. this Saturday here at the Marathon County Historical Society's museum. Cool. All right. Hello. I guess I don't need these anymore. So yeah, if you're just joining us, I don't often say this at the beginning here, but if you have questions at any point, feel free to throw those into the comment section or what have you. I will take a look at that at the end. But yeah, I think we're gonna just jump right in. So History Chats, as I said at the beginning here, we're talking about the neighborhoods of Wausau. Wausau is a big place, and we're celebrating 150 years as a city this year. Well, we can talk about the downtown neighborhoods and the streets and the businesses, but really it's about the people and what is more a connection to the people than the neighborhoods. So that's what we're looking at today. We're looking at what I would argue is the first suburb of Wausau. We'll kind of look at that concept as we go, but this is the southeast side. Yeah. Excuse me. So here we go. Sorry, technical difficulties there for a second. So this is an image here that you might have seen this on our social media, talking about the program today. This is kind of roughly the area we're looking at. It's not quite down into Schofield, right? The airport kind of borders the edge there. But it is, well, actually here, let me bring up, let's give an interactive map. So here we are, this is Google Earth, the city of Wausau, and if we follow the downtown, follow Grand Avenue down here, there's this really interesting area here. So this is the neighborhood we're talking about. Neighborhoods are kind of an interesting concept, right? It's not like it's a formal designation by the city or the state or the government saying this is a neighborhood. Neighborhoods are much more informal. They're more of a thing that we would, it might even depend on what generation you're from or where, even within the same generation, you might have, for example, what do you call this, right? Is this based off of the fact that, sometimes neighborhoods are centered around a community, like a school? John Marshall, is it the John Marshall neighborhood? Sometimes it's parks, right? So is it Memorial Park? Is it the airport? That's kind of a big one. Is it one of the major roads? There's a lot of ways to kind of conceptualize and understand a neighborhood. And again, like you could have two people, you know, from the same generation living in the same place who might have different ways of referring to it. But one of the things, and for example, if we kind of go up to say the southwest side of Wausau, like I don't know, is this the same neighborhood here as this over here? It's kind of sprawls and it kind of goes from one thing to thing. Here, there's kind of a nice continuousness to this. It's confined. You have the Wisconsin River that flows down here. You got the flowage from the Rib River coming in, and then it goes down. So it creates this sort of, right-angled triangle type deal when you add in Grand Avenue. And from the beginning, this has kind of been an interesting way to see this area. And it is kind of an interesting, community. So that's what we're looking at today. I feel like it would be helpful to, well, actually, so that's one of the ways that we would kind of see this thing today. One of the interesting things is back in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, as this area starts to get settled and people start to come up here, make a life in what is going to become Wausau, and the surrounding area. Very frequently our way of seeing the world is not necessarily by, the street over here. Like Grand Avenue doesn't exist, the airport doesn't exist, the schools don't exist, but the river does. And in those early years, very frequently the names that we use for communities is based off of the river from that perspective and going up and down the river. So, for example, Wausau itself was originally called Big Bull Falls, right? Because of the water power there, the falling of the river, the rapids. Little Bull Falls down in Mosinee, and et cetera. And in this case, there was a interesting water feature, I guess. There's nobody living here quite yet, but the river kind of flows, and around here-ish, there's a little eddy. It's a term, it can kind of mean slightly different things, but essentially there's like a little bit of a swirling, like the flow of the river kind of doesn't go straight, it kind of has a little bit of a flow. And it's not necessarily as dangerous as like rapids are, right? But it's something that you want to be aware of if you're going up and down in a canoe or you're taking a load of lumber down, raft of lumber. You want to be aware of it. Now, for whatever reason, they called this Sturgeon Eddy. That's the name of the eddy. I don't know necessarily where sturgeon comes from. No one seems to really have written that down, but that's what they call it, right? And so when we get into the 1880s and you start to see the development of this area, and this is a plat map from 1882. Added some color here so you can see the Wisconsin River. And if we zoom in, you can kind of see this is Wausau starting to creep down. Right around here, that eddy, well, they build a road. And that road kind of serving the farming communities here, because it's mostly farms, is called Sturgeon Eddy. It's the road to Sturgeon Eddy, essentially. This is going to be kind of the backbone. This, along with at this point, they're still, I believe, calling the plank road the South Line Road, which later we're going to call it Grand Avenue. That kind of is the main way of getting around. But like I said, mostly farms we're talking about here. As you can see, these are this is basically a plat map. If you're not aware, is basically how you figure out who owns what land. And this is very similar to what you'd see in rural areas where you have, farms of 40 to 120 to larger acres. And so a lot of these plots of land are divided in that same way, even if they're not actually farming. Some of these, like the Lilies and the St. Austins, are definitely farming. Some of them, like Alexander Stewart and Kate McIndoe here, probably not actively engaged in farming. But as the city starts to creep down, this is going to be an interesting area. At the end here, the St. Austin family in the 1890, I think 1893, it gets finished. They give a bunch of land to the county to build a new facility, a county facility. I'm not sure if they actually just gave the land or they were compensated, but either way, this is one of the main landmarks here at the beginning of the 20th century is the asylum and the County Home and Hospital, which gets built here too. So yeah, in 1893, you see the completion of the asylum for the chronically insane. And then there's a poor farm, which is, you can see here too. This is a larger concept that I really did. we don't necessarily have to get into the history of how we treat mental illness, but essentially that's kind of what this is. Back in the day in the 1800s, there was a real concern about, parts of the community that were, either had or at least were perceived, maybe both, to have some sort of mental problems, deficiencies. Maybe it was sort of a short-term thing. They were going through sort of a break, or maybe they genuinely had long-term chronic issues. And for those people who needed help, they wanted to provide that help. But, we don't necessarily want them nearby. So let's put them out here. Sturgeon Eddy, which you can see the road here. And obviously this is a postcard from like 1908, so this is a little bit later. But the road lets give you access to it. It's off Grand Avenue. It's off the main line. But, it's out of the way. And part of this is, the people that would be put here and we're being cared for at the county home and hospital and the poor farm might be kind of, for example, if at the time, if you had some difficulties financially, right? If you were somebody who just couldn't keep a job, you couldn't provide for your family, you couldn't earn a living, the expectation among many people was like, well, there must be some mental deficiency. There might be something wrong with you, because obviously that's the only reason you could have financial issues. Interesting how that works. But, and maybe there's some truth to that, right? If you have the stress of having to go and provide for a family and not keep down a job, like that can cause you to have some more emotional and mental issues, then, you just don't have to worry about it. But whatever the case might be, one of the ways that they would kind of say is, all right, well, go over here. And they would, this isn't like a criminal thing. Like the judge can just be like, all right, you're going to go here. It's, at least as far as I know, maybe in some cases, again, there's a lot of like uncertainty here. And I don't mean to like, cast aspersions on the way they were doing the best they could. They were trying to provide here. But some people who, maybe they had some financial issues, for example, the poor farm, if you're still mentally or physically able to work, well, maybe it'd be good for you to get out and, plant some crops, work with some cattle. And they had a farm, essentially. This also helped, by the way, to offset the costs of feeding the people at the asylum and all of that fun stuff, too. So ultimately, again, there's more to probably be said about this, but we'll just kind of move on. The asylum, the county home and hospital, which is also built here, not just for like people with mental issues or perceived mental issues. This is also the facility that, say, I'm a farmer in the town of Emmett, or some place at the downriver. If my child on the farm has to have their gallbladder removed or appendicitis or something, well, you take them to the county home and hospital, and that would be the way that you could get medical care. So it wasn't it's kind of a mix of a bunch of different things. And then obviously this is going to grow into, well, maybe not obviously, but it's going to grow into the modern healthcare center that we have today. But for a long time, this is, at the end of Sturgeon Eddy Road, this is kind of the thing out on the extremities. But as we go into the 20th century, we see Wausau start to expand southward. And there's a variety of reasons why we don't necessarily do this earlier, as we'll not necessarily get into here. But you can see this map here from 1901. If you were watching last week, Gary talked about the German neighborhood, right? That's coming south from the downtown area. Well, that's kind of this area here. And then, now we're seeing some new development, right? So let's look at this area here. I'm going to actually bring back up the Google Earth here. One of the things that's really interesting about this too is that, Grand Avenue makes for a nice thoroughfare, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be like a division point. The fact that we have the cemetery here, the fact that there's a landfill, which is like now turned into the sports complex, like it creates a bit of it's just on one side of the area there, right? So you have the Wisconsin Box Company here, but then the cemetery. So on the other side here, now we're looking at this. In particular, this is when we see a development go in. An addition. This is called the Johnson's addition to the City of Wausau. This might need a little bit of explanation. I'm going to do my best here. Basically, when the city incorporated, right, 150 years ago, Wausau becomes Wausau. We're a city. They have to basically lay out here are the borders of that city. At this point, at this point. They used a lot of the terminology that might be used for, go back to the earlier here. You can see there's still a lot of these big, like 80-acre sections or larger. That doesn't really work in a city, though. You don't necessarily, like, if I'm going to buy a house, I don't need to know, I don't want it to go down to that level of granularity of like, well, it's the northeast corner, but then it's the second half of that, and then it's the left half of that. You want to have a little bit better legal description. And so what would happen is, I don't know if that was very particularly effective as an explanation. I apologize. But basically, additions get created within the city limits because not all of the city is immediately, turned into blocks for residential or what have you. But when you do want to do that, that's when the addition comes into play. So in this case, L.H. Johnson, he organizes this land. He lays out the streets. He basically says to the city of Wausau, here, I put the work in. Here's an addition. It's all ready to go, and then people can then buy lots to build houses, and this is basically creating a subdivision, right? A new division of the city. This isn't the first time that this has happened in this region. In fact, up here, just north of Johnson's addition, that's the Elizabeth Single addition. If you actually get down to it, pretty much all of the city is just made up of little bits and pieces of new additions. And honestly, this is how we use the basic reality here is that, like, if I bought a house, let's say you or I bought a house on Roosevelt Street, Roosevelt Street. Instead of being like 123 Roosevelt, the legal description, since the name could change, and some of these names that they initially used don't actually get used. They called it Lincoln Street, for example, or Lincoln Ave instead of, I think Roosevelt? No, Harrison. Anyway, that's still being changed. Houses can be renumbered. It happens. So instead of 123 Roosevelt Street, you would probably have something that the deed, the legal description of that property, that house, would be like the land is lot 5 or 11 and 12 in block 6 of the Johnson's addition, right? So this is just a way of narrowing it down so you know where the land is. Anyway, the important thing here is that not that this is new, they've been doing it, but this is a very interesting, novel way of doing it. Because Johnson had a way of using the media, of using newspaper to really kind of put an interesting spin on things. So, for example, the opening for the new edition, we can finally go and buy land. He had a big old party on the edition. He had a band's 4th of July, big celebration, food, music. Come on down, we got attractions, and see for yourself the potential of this new edition, right? That's not usually how that works, but it seemed to have some effect. A couple weeks later, in the newspaper, they published this, which is a competition. Basically, they wanted free advertising, so they were willing to put up some prizes, and they said, hey, you tell us the top 3 reasons you think that the Johnson's edition is selling so many lots, so much faster than the rest of the lots in all of Wisconsin. Why are we doing so well? And then they published the results. Maybe this is a way of getting around, like, making claims. I'm not really sure, or maybe it's just an advertising thing, right? Oh, the end result is interesting because, and I put the whole thing up. It's a lot of. They published, I think the top 3 prizes. And by the way, if you win, you get a discount on the first year's payment for your lot from 1/3 of the cost to 1/4 of the cost. They also note that children can also, submit, but we're not going to give you a lease because that's illegal. So they also added, 5 to 20 gold pieces. But anyway, they published the top 3 and then 1 or 2 other people too. And it tells a lot about why, even though this is obviously putting this in the best light that they can afford, it does do an interesting job of explaining what it is that's attractive about this area, right? So, for example, let's see here. This is Julia Crosby. She writes that the 3 reasons, right, that this is doing well. Wausau's great. It's centrally located. Quote, having many natural advantages is destined to become the business center of a central and northern Wisconsin. With her great water power and surrounding farming industries fully developed, will support a city of 100,000 population. Shooting high there. Number two, Johnson's addition has been properly platted and recorded. The streets have been graded and deeded to the city, which, as an aside here, that's basically what you legally have to do, but I guess that's a first step if you want to sell lots. But then she finishes it by saying that the lots themselves are deeper than the alleys, are deeper and the alleys wider than any other in the city, which is kind of important. We'll put a pin in that, and I'll come back to that in a second. And then number three, it will be the first new addition to receive the direct benefit of the streetcars. So I talked about streetcars a couple weeks ago. Technically, this is 1901, Johnson's edition, and one of the big reasons that I think that this goes in is because by 1901, there was a feeling that eventually we would get a trolley. Back in the 1890s, 1894, 5, somewhere in there, a company had been formed to do this, to lay out lines and to run the trolley. But the city of Wausau kind of waffled back and forth for a while. It ultimately doesn't go in and doesn't start being used until 1907. So they're a little ahead of things, but they understand that this is going to happen. Like I said, I went into a lot more detail a few weeks ago about the last trolley ride and the whole situation there. But this is a map that was published of the trolley line. And you can see that when it does go in, and this is after some expansions over the years, but essentially it goes up, to the hospital centrally, Hospital North, round downtown Wausau, over the west side to the factories and places over there, and then it goes down, 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 eventually getting on the left side here, down to Schofield and Rothschild, to the paper company. But ultimately, it's this part on the right here. Yeah, this is the neighborhood that's going in, right? This is a neighborhood that's going to benefit from having access to trolleys. And keep in mind that up until this point, most of people's transportation was walking. You might have a horse and buggy, but you're not going to go to work unless you're someone who's very well off. Chances are you're not going to park your horse outside the factory, go work for 10 hours, and then leave. That's hard to do. So most people walk to work, whether it was sort of basic labor, bottom level entry jobs, or whether it was managers. People walked. You wanted to be close by, and so the city was very compact. But this is the start of a new thing. With trolleys, for a nickel, you can get on the trolley and you can pretty much get anywhere into Wausau. So you don't necessarily have to be in Wausau, right? You don't have to be within walking distance of everything. You can be within walking distance of the stuff that you might need immediately, but you don't even need that. And when you add to that the new development that's happening alongside all of this, the automobiles, this is kind of the beginning of what you might call a suburb, right? And arguably, you could make that case that this is kind of a suburb. This is not a community. This is another map. Ooh, shoot, I was going to bring up the full map. Well, the basic idea, this is from 1912. And as you can see on the right, it has this list of all of the industry, the box factories, the granite factories, the ironworks, breweries. On the left side here, above on the southwest side of Wausau, across the river, there's a lot of industry and a lot of neighborhoods that are popping up. But you don't see too many industries in this neighborhood that we're talking about here. That's because that's not really what this was designed. Most of the time, when you see a new neighborhood show up, it's because there's a factory, there's a employer that's at the edge of town, and then they kind of need people nearby, and so they build a bunch of houses. Then you might see some commercial come in, some restaurants and shops and stuff to serve the new neighborhood. But there's no, this is why this could be kind of considered a suburb. This really isn't built around a new factory. This is just built around residential, which is kind of interesting. Other interesting thing here is to note that this is the Johnson's edition, and then by the end of the 19-teens, after the trolleys do start to run, more editions get added. So you get the Klein Brothers edition in 1907, give or take, and then Means edition in 1908, again, circa. This is not a situation where Johnson's edition sells all its lots and then they, add another block and then they add another block. It's interesting because they're adding and they're kind of jumping around. And ultimately, we will see over the next 20 years, these bits get filled in with things. Things like a new elementary school. There's a John Marshall Elementary School built in 1922. By like 1920, 21, the school district of Wausau realized, uh-oh, our population is shifting, and the Longfellow School, which was the first ward school up there, that really wasn't centrally located enough for the population in this new neighborhood. So they built John Marshall. Added on eventually. The original building is, I believe, I don't think this is all part of the original. I think it's just the three-star section there, and then they added on. But yeah, 100 years ago, there you go. Having residential neighborhood, having school is important. Healthcare is important too. Although this isn't necessarily a must, one of the reasons that this is a very attractive place to, bring your family and live is you got the new hospital built, Memorial Hospital just north. This is where I should have put a map. But here, if we look, that's this building here. It's apartments now. But as you can see, just right on the edge of the neighborhood. So that's pretty cool. Alexander Airport goes in around 1924. This is from a little bit later. The mid-20s, initially, like the early 20s, like late teens, early 20s, airplanes are kind of a novelty. They're kind of a thing that some people are experimenting with. But here, we see the future. The Alexander brothers step in and help develop this, and then it becomes part of the run by the city. And this is going to be also another good point, putting people on the map to this area. And of course, these are going to change as well. By 1940, more or less, the area has kind of been settled. This is, that's not to say that everything is finished, like it hasn't changed since then. In fact, some of these city streets and blocks are going to change, particularly around the airport and the healthcare center. But most of the additions are already in place, the school and all of that sort of thing. This is also helped by the fact that Grand Avenue becomes one of these hubs of commerce and businesses. So it's not necessarily something that you would have to move to this neighborhood if you worked there. But because of that, you had, some interesting stuff. So this is from the city limits looking north, Grand Avenue. You can see that there are some billboards and some dealerships up there, a lot of service stations, as Grand Avenue becomes an important part for car culture in the later 20th century. A lot of gas stations and service stations and that sort of thing, pretty much since the beginning of that era. This is a map from 1922, Sanborn map, 52. We're really looking at Grand Avenue here. There's a lot of interesting residential. I'm not going to commercial stuff, right? I'm not going to cover all of them, but just to give you kind of a nice little sampler of stuff. Like I said, John's Auto Sales, one of many new and used auto dealers that pop up on Grand Avenue. Phil's Food Market. Phil's Fine Foods, grocery stores. Again, a new neighborhood's going to need places to go to get food. You don't want to have to take the trolley all the way to the other side of town in order to get groceries. So that is helpful too. The trifecta, trailer rental, barber shop, and beer and liquor depot, Schroeder's Drive-In Corners. Restaurants and taverns, there's a handful of those too. This is an interesting one, my favorite tea room, or favorite tea room, I guess it is. It's really hard to see, but right in here, I don't know if you can see here, let me do the laser pointer. This area here, it was a gas station, but then they had a diner attached to it called Favorite Tea Room. Apparently very good pie. And coffee and things like that. Yeah, just another sort of indicator here of the sort of life that's taking hold here. Now, Wilson Hurd goes in here too. This is this blue building up here. Wilson Hurd is an interesting thing because it kind of throws my whole thesis that this is a suburb kind of out the window because this is manufacturing. 1908, before most of the additions go in, they build a facility to manufacture. Well, Wilson Hurd is one of those companies that doesn't have a direct, obvious thing. They don't just make one thing over their years. They settle in like nameplates and things like that, but they made fly swatters and I think the first big one that they did was like wire bag holders. Um, but yeah, they manufacture here starting in 1908. And they're going to continue to manufacture here through the 1950s. Eventually, in the 1960s, they're going to move up to the north side. But for this is actually a point of contention. And the reason that I'm pointing this out is not necessarily to say, oh, well, it's not a suburb because there's manufacturing here. Can be part of the thing. Um, but also just to note that like things like zoning aren't really in play here. Like there's no like this is the residential zone. This is the even looking at like the Johnson's edition, you might think that that's like all right, this is zoned for residential. Not so much. We still have to kind of sort that out, and city planning becomes a thing. We need to kind of figure out how that's all going to work. But they do. And a lot of other stuff happens too. Of course, the airport gets bigger and then kind of be less prominent as commercial traffic moves elsewhere. But in the 1950s, they added a new terminal. Dedication, became kind of an important place for the community. The healthcare center changed and evolved. We don't have an asylum anymore, but we have, in poor farms, we're not putting people to work, on dairy cattle, but instead we are, providing county-wide health in new ways. And so one of the things that I you might have noticed is I didn't have a lot of the residential photographs, and that's because I didn't want to go and just take some modern pictures. We don't actually have that much in the way of the homes, but we do have this one, care of my family actually. My mother provided this one. This was her house growing up. My grandparents in the early '60s moved to Wausau. John Webb got a job over at Marathon Electric. 50 years earlier, he probably would have had to move the family up into the neighborhood around Marathon Electric. But now we are in, the modern era, and so they settled down on Highland Boulevard, where they raised my aunts, uncles, and my mother. Um, Again, this is I tried to kind of understand and tell the story of the larger development of this community, but ultimately it is a story of people's lives, and I'm sure that that is something that many of you, if you're watching this, maybe are familiar with this area, and you know have that to share as well. Encourage you to do so. Anyway, I think that's probably my time here. Um, I'm gonna check to see if there's any questions or comments. Um, oh, one thing that might be interesting is if people actually what would you call if you're familiar with this neighborhood? I kind of defaulted to like the north southeast side, but I would kind of be curious to find out if you have a name for the neighborhood that you know it as, um, since that might change. Um, cool. Well, I'm gonna let the everything kind of get caught up here. If you have any questions, this is a good time to do that. In the meantime, let me just mention we're continuing our look across the city of Wausau to let's see, here we go. Next week, Gary Gisselman will be back to talk about the near west side of Wausau. How in the 1800s we start to move. It's actually kind of interesting because for a long time we don't have very much happening on the west side of Wausau. But at some point we cross over and we start to add new neighborhoods and communities on the within Wausau on the west side. So that's going to be the subject for next week. That's as always Thursday at 12:30. And again, just a quick plug here: if you're interested in some aviation history, some um, uh, World War II history, the Dick Bong story, History Speaks. That's this Saturday at 2 o'clock. If you want to come to that. Okay. So looks like Gene had comment Sturgeon Eddy area as the name for it. That kind of makes sense. That is kind of the main road there. But yeah, I've also, interestingly, very early on, they seemed to try to sell the name that this was the Lake Park neighborhood, which doesn't take off as far as I'm concerned, could find, but always interesting to see that. Mark on YouTube said Kent Street neighborhood. Interesting. Again, I guess it depends on, what part of the what part of the neighborhood you're part of, because maybe certain streets become more prominent than others. Okay, well, if you're still watching, thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I think we'll maybe call it there. But again, more neighborhood stories next week, and hope you join us for that. Oh, forgot I was on that. Excuse me. Yeah. So thanks for watching. See you next time.